So in 1907, Aurel Stein found a cave that had 40,000 scrolls in it. This cave had been sealed up for 900 years. This was in the caves of 1,000 Buddhas near Dunhuang in western China. I could pitch this as yet another example of a European claiming to discover something that the locals already knew were there. However, Aurel Stein himself never claimed that. He knew there were scrolls there. He'd heard about the discovery. He was looking for them. He just had no idea how many there were or how old. On the other hand, this is not Aurel Stein. This is Paul Pelliot, who came in. We'll hear more about him later. But he's taking a look at what's left of the cave after Aurel Stein removed 24 loads of scrolls. Most of these scrolls were in Chinese, but there were some in Tibetan, Sogdian, Sanskrit, Khotanese, Tangut, etc., etc. The majority were Buddhist, but some were Taoist, Manichaean, Christian, or simply secular. At least one was Jewish. Materials dated from roughly the year 400 to the year 1000. This was Aurel Stein's second Central Asian expedition. He was an employee of the British government of India, and this expedition was jointly funded by the government of India and the British Library, with the understanding that any materials recovered, or you could say loot, would be divided between them in proportion to their share of the funding. It took Aurel Stein nearly a year to travel from Kashmir to Dunhuang. Now, Sir Mark Aurel Stein, Knight Commander of the Indian Empire, Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, etc., was born in the Pest side of Budapest in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He grew up speaking German and Hungarian, learned several other European languages, graduated with a degree in Sanskrit and Old Persian, then entered service with the government of India and became a British citizen. He picked up several more languages, but classical Chinese was not one of them. Although he was a Taoist monk, not Buddhist, the monk Wang decided he would clean and restore the Mogal caves that were otherwise known as the Caves of 1,000 Buddhas. When he started, this cave was filled to sand, almost to the roof with sand. When he cleaned it out, he noticed a sealed up doorway. When he opened that doorway, he found a second cave sealed for 900 years and stacked floor to ceiling with 40,000 scrolls. He sent samples to Chinese officials who were not interested. 7 years later, Aurel Stein was. This is not the library cave, it's the outside. It's actually an early example of what you might call Photoshop, because the scrolls and benches are from a second negative overlaid on the first. Sir Aurel Stein eventually persuaded Monk Wang to sell him thousands of scrolls in exchange for funds to continue his restoration of the Mogal caves. Not all of these scrolls were manuscripts. A few were paintings. And one was the oldest known printed book, a copy of the Diamond Sutra, printed in the year 868. This was not the same Chinese cave with the Chinese Cinderella, by the way, even though the timing is suspicious. So a few months after Sir Aurel, Paul Pelliot arrived. He spoke 13 languages, including Chinese, also Mongolian, Tibetan, Turkic, Sanskrit, etc., which let him make a much more careful selection of the scrolls that all ended up somehow at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. The monk allowed him to buy a few thousand scrolls, These scrolls reached Paris before Pelliot did. Although he had been awarded the Légion d'honneur for conspicuous gallantry during the Boxer Rebellion, he was accused of having faked the scrolls because nobody believed he could have read and understood so many scrolls in a mere 3 weeks. Sir Aurel Stein helped him clear his name. Now, the Chinese assumed that all these foreigners rattling around in remote corners of China were actually spies. In at least one case, they were right. Pelliot was accompanied by Baron Gustav Mannerheim, a Russian imperial officer who spoke 9 languages, including Chinese, but not Finnish, although his family had lived in Finland for generations. He was supposedly an ethnographer, but actually on a mission from Tsar Nicholas II to see just how prepared China might be to defend Xinjiang in case the Russians decided to annex it. Now, if the name Mannerheim sounds familiar, after Finland declared independence, he learnt Finnish, and he became the commander of the Finnish armies that gave the Red Army a nasty surprise when they thought the Soviet Union could just roll over Finland and annex it. Any resemblance to current events, I'm sure, is coincidental. Count Otani was the 22nd abbot of a prominent monastery in Japan. He sponsored several trips to Central Asia, one of which, a couple years after Pelliot, took away quite a few manuscripts from the caves. The British and Russians suspected espionage, of course, but Otani said he was just a good Buddhist, trying to trace the route by which Buddhism had spread to Japan. A little after that, Sergei Oldenburg arrived, and he was able to send a number of manuscripts back to St. Petersburg. As a side note, he had been a classmate of Vladimir Ulyanov, who was executed for having tried and failed to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. Oldenburg's later career may have been helped by the fact that Ulyanov's brother changed his name to Lenin. So why were there... This is the only time you're going to see ships in this talk. So thank you, that's better. Why were there so many peoples and so many religions in Dunhuang? It was a major stop on the Silk Road and the place where it split to go either side of the Taklamakan Desert. You can see it just above Tibet. Dunhuang started as a garrison town built at the far end of the Great Wall of China under the Han Dynasty at about the beginning of the Common Era. The name means something like blazing beacon, or maybe something else, but that's one I choose to believe. For the beacons lit to warn of approaching enemies. By the year 400, when the first of the caves of 1,000 Buddhas were being dug, and the time of the earliest scrolls found there, it was a meeting place of East and West. The lingua franca was Sogdian, an East Iranian language that by now is almost extinct. When China was strong, Dunhuang was under Chinese rule. At other times, it was ruled by Tibet, then Turks, then Tanguts. The poor Tanguts were so thoroughly annihilated by the Mongols that nothing remains except a few manuscripts. Christianity, Judaism, Manichaeism, and Buddhism all passed through Dunhuang from west to east. Not only the east-west Silk Roads, but also the route from India through Tibet to Mongolia passed through Dunhuang. In a sort of reverse, Aurel Stein, a 7th century Chinese Buddhist monk, Xuanzang, had taken many cartloads of manuscripts from India to China. Here's one example scroll that is about 1,600 years old that was found in the Mogao caves. Of course, it's now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, but here is the Diamond Sutra, one of many copies. Actually, possibly because he didn't speak Chinese, Aurel Stein sent about 800 copies of the Diamond Sutra back to the British Library. But we know that this was printed on the 11th of May of 868 because of the dedication. It took another 750 years before woodblock printing reached Western Europe, a little after paper and only slightly before movable type. So the Jewish prayer was discovered in 1908 in the Dunhuang caves of Gansu province of China, now in the Bibliothèque Nationale, so you know who collected it. The library cave, with its 40,000 scrolls, was one of the Mogao caves, otherwise known as the Caves of 1,000 Buddhas, very near Dunhuang. The relief map shows how travel between east and west was constrained to a narrow corridor between the Tibetan Plateau and the Mongolian steppe. The corridor was known as the Heshi Corridor in modern Gansu province. The yellow diamond marks the location of the Caves of 1,000 Buddhas. The small inset map shows how this narrow corridor acted as a funnel into China and back out. This sample letter was written by a Manichaean bishop in the Sogdian language. So the Manichaeans had a prophet, a Persian named Mani, who said he had come to correct the corrupted scriptures of the Buddha, Jesus, Zoroaster, etc. Not surprisingly, Manichaeans were heavily persecuted by the Christian Roman Emperor and also the Sasanian Persian Zoroastrians. Many of them fled east, and in fact there's still a few, just a handful, in Fujian province opposite Taiwan. The Sogdians were an Eastern Iranian nationality, the preeminent Silk Road traders for centuries. They had a network extending to Xi'an, the ancient capital of China. They flourished until a prominent Sogdian led a serious rebellion against the Tang dynasty in the 700s, after which there were massacres, and the surviving Sogdians tried very hard to pass as Chinese. There were about 40,000 scrolls walled up in the so-called library cave near Dunhuang. Paul Pelliot and others found more in others of the caves of 1,000 Buddhas, and more again, also near Dunhuang, but never in the kind of quantity as the library cave. There are now some 100,000 Dunhuang scrolls scattered around the world. The International Dunhuang Project has more than 500,000 images so far, although not all of them are images of manuscripts or scrolls. Some are paintings, frescoes, other articles. The project is ongoing and involves scholars from many institutions in many countries. The Chinese regard Sir Aurel Stein and Paul Pelliot as thieves, but was taking so many of these Dunhuang scrolls to Beijing, which is what happened after the Europeans were through pillaging. Was that really so different to take them so far from Dunhuang? But in any event, I raise a toast, or I would if I had anything in my hand, a virtual toast. Not so much to the explorers of the 20th century, but to those who are now reuniting the collection digitally. Thank you.